It was a late autumn afternoon when Marcus Cole's old Ford pickup rumbled down the winding gravel roads of the Missouri Ozarks. The air, crisp and biting, carried the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine. Sunlight, weak and filtered through a thick canopy of oaks and maples, cast long, dancing shadows across the road. Marcus was a journalist, a true crime writer with a penchant for cold cases and a skepticism that bordered on cynicism. His last successful book, a meticulous deconstruction of an unsolved disappearance in rural Vermont, had put his name on the map. This time, he was after something different, a local legend, a ghost story rooted in the kind of human depravity he found endlessly fascinating. He was here to investigate the Callahan Brothers. The story was a staple of Ozark folklore, whispered around campfires and passed down through generations. Two brothers, Elias and Silas Callahan, who owned a secluded hunting lodge in the 1970s, were rumored to have been responsible for a series of vanishings that plagued the region for years. Hunters, hikers, even a few young couples on a weekend getaway, they all went missing, their cases eventually turning cold. The local police, understaffed and overwhelmed, had never been able to connect the disappearances directly to the brothers. The lodge itself, a sprawling, dilapidated log cabin, had been abandoned for decades, its secrets sealed shut with boarded-up windows and an overgrown driveway. Marcus, however, had found something new. An old, dusty box of police reports from a retired sheriff's deputy, a tip he'd received from a contact he'd cultivated over years. The reports, unofficial and filled with handwritten notes, suggested a pattern the public had never known about. The missing people had one thing in common. They had all placed a call to the Callahan Lodge just before they vanished. This was the lead he needed. It wasn't a ghost story anymore. It was a potential murder case, hidden in plain sight. The old deputy's notes led him to a small forgotten town named Willow Creek. It was the last known stop for most of the missing individuals. Marcus had planned to spend a week here, talking to locals, digging through archives, and, if he was brave enough, venturing to the lodge itself. He pulled into the town square, a cluster of a few weathered buildings surrounding a rusted-out gazebo. The general store was the only place that looked remotely open. As he parked, a woman stepped out, wiping her hands on a worn apron. She was in her late 50s with a stern face softened by kind, tired eyes. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice a low drawl. "No, ma'am, just passing through. Name's Marcus Cole." "Well, Marcus Cole, this here is Willow Creek. I'm Eleanor Vance. I run the store." She looked at his vehicle, then back at him, a flicker of suspicion in her gaze. "You look like a journalist. Don't see many of your kind out this way. You writing about the Callahans?" Marcus was taken aback by her directness. He hadn't even mentioned the name. "Yes, I am. I'm researching a book on the old disappearances." Eleanor's expression hardened. "That's a past best left buried." She gestured with her chin towards a faded photograph tacked to a post outside the store. It showed a young man with a wide, innocent smile, his arm around a young woman. "That was my brother Daniel. He was one of them. Vanished 27 years ago. Last person to see him alive was Elias Callahan at the lodge." Her words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. This was personal for her. "I'm sorry," he said genuinely. "I didn't know." "You couldn't. The official story was that they went hiking and never came back. It wasn't true. Daniel called me from the lodge. Said he and his girlfriend were having a wonderful time. Said he'd call in the morning. He never did." Eleanor's grief was palpable, a heavy weight that hung in the silence between them. "The police were useless," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Said there was no evidence. Elias and Silas were charming, popular with some of the hunting clubs. They were always a bit strange, though, kept to themselves mostly, but no one ever thought they'd do something like this." Marcus wanted to ask more questions, but he could see the pain in her eyes. "I understand if you don't want to talk about it," he said, "but any information you can give me would be invaluable, for Daniel's sake." Eleanor sighed, a long, weary sound. "Come back in an hour. I'll get you a cup of coffee. I have some old things of Daniel's." Maybe something will help. He spent the next hour at the town's small, dusty library, sifting through microfilm of old newspapers. The stories were vague, focused more on the search parties than the specifics of the missing. But one detail kept cropping up. Unusual tire tracks, found near the last known location of one of the missing couples. The police reports, however, made no mention of them. When he returned to the general store, Eleanor was waiting. She handed him a thick, leather-bound scrapbook. "Daniel kept this. It's got photos, letters, everything. Maybe something in here will make sense to you." She hesitated. "Be careful, Marcus. That place, it's not just an old building. People have a way of disappearing there." Marcus thanked her and took the scrapbook. He could feel the weight of it, the history and the sorrow. He drove to the local motel, a single-story brick building with peeling paint. The room was sparse, but clean. He opened the scrapbook and began to pore over Daniel's life, searching for a clue, any detail that could connect him to the Callahans beyond a single phone call. The photos showed a happy, vibrant young man. But tucked between two letters, Marcus found a faded map. It was hand-drawn, a detailed sketch of the trails around the Callahan Lodge. It looked like a personal guide, with small penciled notes about landmarks and shortcuts. What caught his eye, though, was a small, crudely drawn X near a thick patch of woods marked the Old Mine. The old police notes he'd been given mentioned that Elias and Silas Callahan had inherited the land from their grandfather, a prospector who had tried and failed to strike it rich in the area. The notes mentioned a disused mine shaft. The map Eleanor's brother had drawn seemed to confirm its location. Marcus had a hunch, a gut feeling, a journalist's instinct. This wasn't just a story about two isolated brothers and their dark secrets. This was a story with a physical location, a place where the truth might still be buried. The map felt like a key to a door he wasn't sure he wanted to open. He looked out the window at the deepening twilight, a shiver running down his spine. The air was getting colder, the shadows longer, and somewhere out there, deep in the woods, the Callahan Lodge was waiting. The next morning, a thick grey fog clung to the Ozark hills, muting the vibrant autumn colors. Marcus drove his truck as close as he could to the location of the Callahan Lodge, guided by a barely there dirt road that wound deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. The outside world felt 1,000,000 miles away, replaced by the hushed, expectant stillness of the forest. He parked the truck beside a fallen oak and began his hike, the faded map from Daniel's scrapbook clutched in his hand. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with thorny vines and thick underbrush. The map, he realized, was more than just a guide. It was a record of someone who had walked this path before him, someone who had vanished into the very silence he was now walking into. The lodge itself was a grim monument to time. A massive log cabin, its roof sagging and its porch collapsing, loomed through the mist. The windows were all boarded up, some with planks so rotted they were barely holding on. A dark, gaping hole where the front door once was seemed to stare at him like a blind eye. A rusted sign, hanging precariously from a chain, read, "Callahan Brothers Hunting Lodge." The sign was a cruel joke, a reminder of the pleasantry that had lured so many to their doom. He bypassed the main building, his focus on the map's most crucial marking, the Old Mine. The map led him behind the lodge, down a steep, rocky path. It was a perilous trek, but Marcus was determined. The ground was treacherous with slick mud and loose rocks, and he had to use trees for support to keep from falling. Finally, the path opened up into a small, overgrown clearing. He saw it then, a collapsed wooden structure, barely recognizable as a mine entrance. The mouth of the mine was a dark, square void, partially filled with rock and rubble but clearly still open. A wave of apprehension washed over him. This was a grave risk. He had no spelunking equipment, just a flashlight and the clothes on his back. But the journalist's instinct, the same one that had brought him here, was too strong to ignore. He had to know what was in there. He climbed carefully down the pile of rubble, the air growing colder and damper the deeper he went. The beam of his flashlight cut a circle through the absolute darkness, illuminating the crude, hand-hewn walls of the mine shaft. It was a short tunnel, no more than 20 feet, and it ended abruptly at a wooden door. The door was old, its hinges rusted, but it was locked with a heavy chain and padlock. This was a dead end. Marcus felt a pang of frustration. He'd come all this way, risking his neck, only to be met with a locked door. He shone his light on the padlock, a massive, antique thing that wouldn't budge. He felt along the edges of the door, his fingers searching for a way in. That's when he felt it. A small, loose section of wall. It wasn't stone or wood, but a thick canvas. He pulled at it, and a large portion of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden passage. The air that rushed out was stale and heavy, filled with a smell Marcus couldn't immediately place. He stepped through, his flashlight beam revealing a much larger space. This was not a mine. It was a chamber, a series of underground rooms carved out of the earth. The walls were lined with old handmade shelves, holding tools, crates, and what looked like jars filled with preserved items. The floor was packed earth, uneven and littered with dust and debris. As he walked deeper, the flashlight beam caught on something. A workbench covered in tools. Not prospecting tools, but things like scalpels, hammers, and saws. There were large, rusty hooks hanging from the ceiling, the kind used for butchering meat. This was not a mine, and it was certainly not a hunting lodge's simple workshop. It was a macabre, makeshift surgical theater. Marcus felt his stomach lurch. A cold, nauseating realization washed over him. The Callahan brothers weren't just murderers, they were something far more sinister. He shone his light on the crates. They were filled with old, rotting clothes. He recognized a faded flannel shirt, its colors long since lost to time, and a pair of worn-out denim jeans. They looked like something a young man in the 1970s would wear. Daniel, he thought, the journalist in him now giving way to a sickening dread. He was about to turn back, to get out of this awful place, when a low, metallic scraping sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the chamber. He froze, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was not alone. The sound was faint but distinct. He took a few steps forward, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. It landed on a partially hidden door made of thick, riveted steel. The scraping sound came from behind it. He listened intently. It was the sound of something being dragged across a stone floor, a slow, deliberate scrape. His mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. But there wasn't one. The lodge had been abandoned for decades. He was the only one who knew about this place. The sounds were impossible. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had to see what was behind that door. He had to, for the sake of the story, for the sake of Daniel and all the others. He approached the steel door and put his ear against it. The scraping stopped. A new sound replaced it, a faint, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. Then a low, rasping breath. He backed away, a tremor in his hand causing the flashlight beam to shake. The air, already stale and heavy, now felt impossibly thick, as if a presence had just drawn in close. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to leave. This was no longer a cold case. It was something alive and lurking in the dark. He turned and stumbled back towards the opening, his senses on high alert. He had to get out. He had to tell someone what he had found. The truth of the Callahan brothers was not a ghost story, but a waking nightmare. Marcus stumbled out of the mineshaft, gasping for breath, the stale metallic air of the underground chamber still clinging to his clothes. He scrambled back up the path, his mind reeling from the discovery. The sounds, the tools, the sickening realization. It all felt like a fever dream. But the damp earth on his shoes and the cold, stinging air were a grim reminder that it was all too real. He didn't stop until he reached his truck. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and started the engine with a roar that seemed to tear the silence of the woods apart. He drove back to Willow Creek in a daze, the twisting roads a blur. He knew he had to talk to Eleanor. She was the only one who seemed to believe something truly sinister had happened. He found her at the general store, methodically wiping down the counter. Her face, usually so composed, looked etched with worry. "You went to the lodge, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I did. And I found something, a hidden chamber behind the old mine. It was a workshop for butchering. Human remains, I think," he said, the words catching in his throat. Eleanor didn't flinch. Her eyes, however, welled up with tears. "I knew it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I always knew. Daniel wouldn't just vanish. They did this to him." "There's more," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There were noises in a locked room, a scraping sound and breathing. Eleanor's expression became one of sheer terror. "No, that's not possible. Elias and Silas, they're gone. They disappeared years ago. The police thought they were dead. A cave-in, maybe. A flash flood. No one ever found their bodies, did they?" Marcus asked. "No, but no one's seen them since the 80s. Everyone assumed they died in the hills somewhere. The lodge fell to ruin after." Marcus pulled out a map from his pocket. It was a faded county map of the Ozarks he had picked up in town. "Show me where the old Callahan property is," he said. Eleanor pointed, her finger tracing the squiggly lines of the roads. Marcus then pulled out the hand-drawn map from Daniel's scrapbook. He laid it over the county map, aligning the landmarks. They were a perfect match. "This map, Daniel's map," he said. "It's incredibly detailed. It shows all the trails and paths around the lodge, all the way to a series of old hunting cabins scattered through the woods. It looks like he was exploring the whole area. He might have seen something." Eleanor looked at the map, her eyes widening. Daniel was always a curious one. He loved to explore. He probably thought it was a fun little adventure staying at the lodge. He had no idea what he was walking into. A customer walked in then, a rugged-looking man in a flannel shirt. Eleanor's demeanor shifted instantly. She became the stoic shopkeeper, her face a mask of calm professionalism. "Can I help you, Hank?" she asked. "Just picking up a few things, Eleanor. Heard you had a visitor in town. A city boy come looking for trouble." Hank's gaze fell on Marcus, a cold, unfriendly stare. "Just a journalist," Eleanor said, her voice strained. "He's researching a story." "The Callahan story," Hank said, a hint of disdain in his voice. "Some things are best left alone. You'd do well to listen to the locals, boy. We know what's out there." Marcus felt a prickle of unease. "What's that, Hank? A ghost?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Hank let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Worse. People around here have a way of disappearing. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. The woods, they don't give up their secrets easy. Don't go looking for something you're not meant to find." He paid for his items and left, but the threat in his voice lingered. Eleanor waited until he was gone, then let out a shaky breath. Hank's father was a friend of the Callahans. He still lives out on a property near the lodge. There are others, people who knew them, people who protect their secrets. Marcus felt the weight of the town's silence and unspoken loyalties. This wasn't just a cold case. It was a deeply ingrained part of the community's history, a wound that refused to heal and was actively being covered up. "I need to go back to the lodge," he said, surprising himself with his own resolve. "I need to see what's in that room. I need proof." "You can't go alone," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "It's too dangerous. I've heard stories, not just about the brothers, about what they did, about what they were making." "Making?" Marcus asked, his blood running cold. "I don't know the details, just whispers. My father used to say Elias and Silas had a hobby, something they were proud of, something they wanted to show off. He said they built a maze of their own making. A maze." The word resonated with a chilling finality. It wasn't just a place of murder, it was a place of sport. A game. The thought was sickening. "I have a friend," Eleanor continued, "a retired police detective. He's the one who gave the deputy's files to your contact. His name is Richard Vance. He's my brother's best friend. He's been obsessed with this case for years. He's the only one who might be able to help you without turning you away." Marcus took down the address. He knew he had to move fast. The scraping sound, the breathing. It couldn't have been his imagination. The Callahans, or whoever was in that lodge, were not ghosts. They were something far more terrifying. And they were still there, waiting. He drove towards Richard Vance's house. The dark, looming presence of the Ozark woods, feeling less like a peaceful landscape and more like a cage, its bars made of secrets and lies. He was a long way from home, and the trail he had picked up was leading him into a place where the lines between hunter and hunted were blurring, and he was quickly becoming the latter. Richard Vance's house was a small, well-kept cottage on the outskirts of Willow Creek, surrounded by a meticulously maintained garden. The contrast between the house's peaceful exterior and the dark obsession that drove its owner was stark. Richard was a man in his early 70s, his face a roadmap of deep-set wrinkles and weary lines. He had a thick shock of white hair and the piercing blue eyes of a man who had seen too much and found too little. He greeted Marcus with a handshake that was surprisingly firm. "Eleanor called me," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "She said you were poking around the lodge. Said you found something." "I did," Marcus said, sitting down in a worn armchair. He laid out the maps, the old police notes, and recounted his experience in the hidden chamber. He described the workbench, the tools, the clothes, and the terrifying sounds coming from the steel door. Richard listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Marcus finished, the older man leaned back, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. "I've been waiting for someone like you for a long time, Marcus. Someone with no ties to this town, someone with nothing to lose. I've gone over this case 100 times. The official reports are a lie. They were a cover-up." "Who was covering it up?" Marcus asked. "Everyone," Richard said, a bitter note in his voice. "The sheriff at the time, some of the local businessmen. Elias and Silas, they weren't just brothers. They were part of an exclusive hunting club, the kind with big money and bigger secrets. They brought in hunters from all over the country. Politicians, CEOs, people who wanted a thrill, a very specific kind of thrill." "What kind of thrill?" Marcus pressed. Richard hesitated, his eyes distant. "I don't know for sure, but I have my theories. The tire tracks, the ones you found in the old newspaper articles, they were from an ATV, a modified one. The sheriff at the time said they were nothing, but they led right to the lodge, and they were found on every single one of the crime scenes, every missing person. They were all linked to that lodge by an initial phone call and then by those tracks. So the Callahans were not the only ones involved? I don't think so. I think they had help. Maybe a network of people who wanted to get away with something. People who would pay for the privilege of hunting their own kind." The phrase hung in the air, a sickening implication. Human hunting. It fit with the macabre workshop, the tools, the idea of a maze, a game with human lives. "You said you heard noises in the chamber," Richard said, his tone serious now, breathing and scraping. "That's the part that chills me. If Elias and Silas are dead, who's in there?" "That's what I want to find out," Marcus said. "I'm going back. This time, I'll be prepared. I need a crowbar, maybe a drill, something to get through that door." Richard's face was a study in conflict. "It's too dangerous. What if they're still alive? What if they've been living down there all this time? Or worse, what if there's someone else? Someone who took over their business? I have to know, Richard. For Daniel, and for the others," Marcus said, the words of Eleanor resonating in his mind. Richard sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I can't let you go in alone. I'll go with you." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You're a retired cop. You've done enough. Give me what you have and I'll handle it." Richard shook his head. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for Daniel. He was my best friend. The last thing he said to me was that he was going to the lodge, that he was going to see something amazing. That's what a letter he sent me said. I never thought anything of it until he went missing. I've lived with that regret for 27 years. I'm going with you, Marcus. Either we get to the bottom of this together, or you're not getting another thing from me." Marcus saw the fierce determination in the old man's eyes and knew there was no changing his mind. "All right," he said, relenting. "But we go in tonight. We have to be quick, and we have to be quiet. The less people who know, the better. Especially not Hank or his kind." Richard nodded in agreement. He went into a closet and came back with a heavy-duty flashlight and a police-issue crowbar. "This was Daniel's," he said, handing Marcus the crowbar. "He was a carpenter, made it himself. I took it from his workshop after he vanished. I always hoped it would come in handy one day." The weight of the tool in Marcus's hand felt significant, a tangible link to the past, a weapon against a 27-year-old crime. He looked at Richard, a man who had been chasing a ghost for half his life. "Thank you," Marcus said. "I won't let you down." The old detective gave him a tight, grim smile. "I know you won't. I just hope you're ready for what we find down there. The truth is often uglier than the lie. In this case, I have a feeling it's far worse." As dusk settled over the Ozarks, Marcus and Richard made their final preparations. The air was colder, a silent, creeping chill. They were two men, one young and driven by a story, the other old and haunted by a memory, about to descend into a place where the lines between history and living terror were about to be erased. The Callahan Lodge was no longer a legend. It was a tomb, and they were about to open its door. The moon was a sliver of silver light in the inky sky, offering little illumination as Marcus and Richard made their way back to the Callahan Lodge. The fog had lifted, replaced by a biting chill that seeped through their jackets. The woods were a symphony of night sounds, the rustle of nocturnal animals, the hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow a potential threat. They approached the lodge from a different angle, circling around to avoid the main entrance. Richard, a native of the area, knew a network of old logging paths. The lodge stood as a dark silhouette against the pale sky, its broken windows like the empty eyes of a skull. "This is it," Richard whispered, his voice low and strained. "The front door's a death trap, too much noise. We'll go in from the back. There's a cellar entrance I remember from the old days. It's probably rotted out." He was right. They found the cellar door, a square of rotted wood half buried in the ground. It creaked and groaned as they lifted it, a sound that seemed to echo for miles. They descended into the cellar, a space filled with the damp, earthy smell of decay. Marcus's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing shelves of cobweb-covered jars and rusted tools. The cellar was a mess, but it was empty. They moved quickly through the cellar, Richard leading the way, his knowledge of the old building proving invaluable. He found a set of stone steps leading upward, and they ascended, emerging into the main living area of the lodge. The room was a ghost of its former self. A massive stone fireplace stood cold and empty, a deer head with one antler missing hung crookedly on the wall, and the floor was littered with the detritus of decades of neglect. "The mine entrance is out this way," Marcus whispered, pointing toward a back door. They slipped outside, the cold air hitting them with a renewed force. They found the mine shaft, and with a shared sense of dread, descended into the dark. The hidden chamber was just as Marcus remembered. The air was still and heavy, and the scent of decay was stronger here. The workbench, the tools, the clothes, they all stood as grim testament to the horrors that had taken place. Marcus's flashlight beam found the steel door, and he felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. "Are you ready?" Richard asked, his voice low and serious. Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." Richard took out the crowbar, a grim determination on his face. He pried at the edge of the door, but it was locked tight. "It's bolted from the inside," he said, frustration in his voice. "We'll have to go another way." He walked the perimeter of the room, shining his light along the stone walls. "The maps," he said, his voice a low whisper. Daniel's map showed a series of tunnels. I remember my dad talking about them. The brothers were always expanding, digging. They didn't want to get rich, they wanted to get lost. They had a network of tunnels all over this property. It was their pride and joy. They called it the Labyrinth. Marcus's blood ran cold. The maze. Eleanor's words echoed in his head. The labyrinth. He looked at the walls, his mind connecting the dots. The X on Daniel's map wasn't just a place. It was a starting point. Richard's light landed on a small, rusted lever set into the wall, partially hidden by a pile of crates. "What is this?" he said, his voice full of curiosity. He pulled the lever, and a low, grinding sound echoed through the chamber. A section of the floor, a single slab of stone, slid to the side, revealing a dark, vertical shaft. A ladder, made of old, creaking wood, descended into the blackness. "This is it," Richard said, a grim look on his face. "This is how they got in, and how they got out." Marcus and Richard descended the ladder, their flashlights cutting through the thick, absolute darkness below. The air grew colder, the sound of their boots on the wooden rungs echoing ominously in the silent shaft. They reached the bottom, their feet landing on cold, packed earth. The tunnel was narrow, no more than 3 feet wide, and the ceiling was so low they had to crouch to walk. The walls were rough-hewn, carved out of the solid rock. The smell was overpowering now, a mixture of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sweet, the scent of blood. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth, the tunnels began to branch. The hand-drawn map from Daniel's scrapbook became their only guide. They followed the path he had marked, a series of winding turns that led them away from the mine shaft and deeper into the unknown. The tunnels were a disorienting, claustrophobic maze, a place built for confusion and fear. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the sound of his boots on the cold earth. They rounded a corner, and Marcus's flashlight beam landed on something in the tunnel ahead. A pair of worn-out sneakers, their laces undone. They were placed neatly on the ground, as if someone had taken them off and walked away. He knelt down, his hand trembling as he touched one of the shoes. They felt old, brittle with age. "Those look like the shoes my brother had," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The same brand, the same color. The shoes were a chilling breadcrumb, a sign that they were on the right path, but also a terrifying reminder of what had happened here. As they moved on, they found more signs. A broken camera, its film still inside. A pair of sunglasses, their lens cracked. Small personal effects, scattered like pieces of a gruesome puzzle. Then they heard it. The same scraping sound Marcus had heard before, now much closer. It was a slow, deliberate sound coming from around the next bend. The breathing was there too, a low, rasping breath that sounded like a dry leaf being dragged across the ground. It was inhuman, and it was getting closer. "It's not Elias and Silas," Richard whispered, his voice a choked gasp. "It's something else, something they made." Marcus froze, his mind reeling. The maze, the tools, the human remains. It all pointed to a truth so horrifying, it seemed impossible. The Callahans weren't just murderers, they were artists of human depravity. And the labyrinth was their masterpiece. The footsteps grew louder, and a shadow moved in the flickering light of their flashlights. It was time to stop being the investigators and start being the survivors. They were trapped in the heart of the labyrinth, and they were not alone. The shadow rounded the corner, and Marcus and Richard froze, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. It wasn't a monster, a ghost, or a supernatural creature. It was a man. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes a collection of old, stained rags. His face was obscured by a thick, filthy beard, and his hair was a tangled mess of dreadlocks. His eyes, however, were what truly captured their attention. A wild, manic glint that was both terrifying and utterly lost. He was dragging something behind him, a burlap sack that scraped against the stone floor. He stopped a few feet away, his head cocked to the side, listening. His breath was a low, rasping sound, the sound Marcus had heard before. The man was not speaking, just making small, guttural noises in the back of his throat. "My God," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. It's him." "Who?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a breath. Silas, Richard said, his face a mask of disbelief. Silas Callahan. But he's a husk, a shell of a man. Marcus looked closer. The man was indeed Silas, but he was a shadow of his former self. He was rail-thin, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. He looked like he had been living in the dark for decades. But he was not alone. As Marcus's flashlight beam swept past Silas, it landed on something else. A crude metal collar was fixed around the man's neck, a thick, heavy chain attached to it. The chain was tethered to the wall. Silas was a prisoner, a pet, or something far worse. The sack he was dragging began to shift, and a hand, pale and thin, emerged from the opening. It was the hand of a woman, a young woman, her face ashen with terror. Her mouth was bound, and her eyes were wide with a silent scream. Silas's head snapped up, and he let out a low growl, a sound of pure, animalistic rage. He saw Marcus and Richard, and the glint in his eyes intensified. He began to drag the sack faster, pulling it towards him as if to protect his prize. "Silas," Richard said, his voice strained but firm. "It's me, Richard, from town. Do you remember?" Silas seemed to stop, his head cocked to the side as if trying to process the sound of the name. For a moment, a flicker of humanity seemed to cross his face, but it was quickly replaced by the same wild, predatory look. A voice, low and smooth, echoed from a dark passage to their right. "Silas, don't play with your food. We have guests, and they look quite hungry for a story." A man emerged from the shadows. He was older, perhaps in his late 70s, but he was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his white hair neatly combed, his hands clean and manicured. His eyes, however, held the same chilling intensity as Silas's, but his was a calculated, intellectual malice. "Elias," Richard breathed, his voice filled with a cold dread. "You're alive." Elias Callahan smiled, a thin, cruel slash across his face. "Alive and well, Richard. And you've brought a friend, the journalist. I've been reading your articles, Mr. Cole. I admire your work. You have a knack for getting to the heart of things. But you've come to a place where the heart is a little harder to find." Marcus's mind was racing. This was not just a case of two brothers gone mad. This was something planned, something systematic. Elias was the mastermind. Silas was the beast, the hunter they had made. "What is this?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and rage. "This, Mr. Cole," Elias said, gesturing around the labyrinth with an open hand, "is the game. You see, the world is full of hunters, men who crave a different kind of prey. My brother and I, we provided it. We created a perfect system. We would lure them in, the curious, the adventurous, the ones who thought they were smarter than us. And then we would give them a choice. Become a hunter, or become the hunted." He walked towards them, his movement smooth and deliberate. Silas, as you can see, chose the latter. His mind broke a long time ago. Now he's a magnificent creature, my most prized hunter. He has a nose for fear, and he is tireless. He lives down here in the dark, and he protects our secrets, and he provides for us. He gestured to the young woman in the sack. "We have to eat, after all, but we prefer to eat well." The sickening truth of it all, the reality behind the whispers and the legends, hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow. The Callahans weren't just murderers, they were cannibals, and Silas was their trained, domesticated killer. "And now you," Elias said, his smile widening. "You have two choices. You can join me, learn from me, or you can run. The labyrinth is a big place, Mr. Cole, full of secrets. You can try to escape, but I assure you, Silas is very good at what he does." Elias gestured to a wall behind him, where a series of large metal cages were stacked. In them were other people, their faces gaunt, their eyes filled with the same empty terror as the woman in the sack. They were the ones who had been caught, the ones who were still living, waiting for their turn. "They are my collection," Elias said, a strange pride in his voice. And you, Mr. Cole, would make a fine addition to it. A rare find. A journalist who knows too much. The game has begun. The labyrinth is now your playground, your final stage. Welcome to the show. A click echoed in the tunnel. It was a lock, closing a gate behind them. They were trapped. Marcus looked at Richard, his face pale with a mix of fear and resignation. They had come for the truth, and they had found it. But the truth was a trap, and they were the new players in a very old, very real, and very macabre game. The metallic click of the lock reverberated in the narrow tunnel, a chilling and final sound. Elias Callahan stood before them, his smile a mask of malevolent satisfaction. He held a small, antique key in his hand, twirling it idly. "The rules are simple," he said, his voice a low, theatrical purr. "The hunt begins now. You have a head start. Silas, my dear brother, is a slow starter. But once he gets your scent, he never loses it. Your goal is to find the exit. The exit is on the other side of the lodge in the main cellar. You have to find the way through the labyrinth. But be warned, there are traps. Traps for the body and traps for the mind." He gestured to the cages. "They tried to escape. They failed. They are now an audience, watching your performance. You have one chance, gentlemen. Don't disappoint." Elias turned and walked back into the darkness from which he had come. They heard the sound of a door closing and then silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. "We have to go," Richard said, his voice a strained whisper. "Now, he's not bluffing. That Silas is prey in that sack. That poor girl. He's insane, Marcus. He's completely unhinged." They turned and ran, plunging deeper into the maze of tunnels. The air was a mixture of damp earth and something foul, a scent of rot and decay that was almost unbearable. They had to use their flashlights sparingly, turning them on for a few seconds at a time to check Daniel's map before plunging back into the blackness. The map was their only lifeline, a guide to a place that was designed to be a prison. The tunnels twisted and turned, and soon Marcus felt completely disoriented. They passed through a large cavern, its ceiling dripping with moisture, its walls lined with more discarded belongings, backpacks, camping gear, even a child's toy. The sheer scale of the operation, the number of victims, was mind-numbing. Richard pointed a trembling finger at a small, hand-painted sign on the cavern wall. It read, "The Collector's Gallery." He shuddered. Elias was always a collector. He collected rare things. I guess this is his most prized collection. They had to move faster. The tunnels were a network of dead ends and false paths. Marcus realized that the map was not just a guide, but a key. Daniel had not simply drawn the paths. He had marked a specific route, a way to navigate the labyrinth. He had drawn a small, cryptic symbol next to the route, a circle with a dot in the center. "The old deputy's notes," Marcus said, his voice a breathless gasp. He mentioned a symbol. The Callahan's grandfather, the prospector, used a specific mark to identify his land claims. The circle with the dot. It's on all the old maps. Daniel must have found it. He must have realized this wasn't just a maze. It was a path, a way to get to the heart of the labyrinth. They followed the markings on the map, running through the tunnels. The path was a winding, circuitous route, but it was the only one that seemed to make sense. Then they heard it. The scraping. It was closer now, much closer, and it was getting faster. The rhythmic sound of Silas's boots on the earth, the rustle of his ragged clothes. He was a relentless hunter, a ghost of a man driven by a hunger that was both physical and psychological. They turned a corner and saw a glimmer of light up ahead. It was an opening, a large rectangular shaft leading upward. A set of rickety wooden stairs descended into it. "The cellar," Richard said, his voice filled with relief. "We made it." They scrambled up the stairs, their legs burning with effort. They reached the top and found themselves in a small, dusty cellar, its walls lined with shelves of old jars and empty bottles. A wooden door, heavy and thick, stood on the far side of the room. It was the exit. "He's right behind us," Marcus said, his heart pounding. "He's coming." Richard fumbled with the handle of the cellar door. It was locked. "Damn it," he said, his face a mask of frustration. "He's locked it from the outside." "The old deputy's notes mentioned it," Marcus said, his mind racing. The Callahans built a series of underground tunnels with remote locking mechanisms. They could control the whole thing. It was part of the game. They would lock the escape route just when their prey thought they were safe. The scraping sound was louder now, and they could hear the guttural, rasping breaths of Silas as he descended the stairs. He was right behind them. There was no time to panic. They were trapped, caught in the heart of the labyrinth with a hunter who had lived in its darkness for decades. "The air vents," Richard said, his eyes scanning the walls. There were vents in the old blueprints. They were used to clear the air. They were small, but they could be a way out. They found a vent on the floor, a rusted metal grate. It was small, no more than a foot in diameter, but it was big enough for a small person. Richard, however, was too big. "Go," Richard said, his voice firm. "You're younger, you're smaller. You can make it. I'll hold him off. Get out of here, Marcus, and tell the world what happened here. Tell them about Daniel. Tell them about Elias and Silas. Expose them. Don't let them win." "No," Marcus said, his voice filled with panic. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," Richard said, his eyes pleading. "It's the only way. I'm an old man. My life's almost over, but you can make a difference. You can bring them to justice. Now go, for Daniel." The words were a brutal, painful truth. Marcus hesitated for a moment, his mind reeling. He couldn't leave Richard behind. But if he didn't, they would both die. The scraping was at the bottom of the stairs, and he could hear the low, hungry growl of Silas as he climbed. He made a decision. He would go. He would get help. He would come back for Richard. He pried at the metal grate with his bare hands, his fingers bleeding from the effort. It was a race against time, a desperate, silent battle against a relentless enemy. And he was losing. The vent grate was rusted and stubborn, a cruel final obstacle in a maze designed for torment. Marcus gritted his teeth, his fingers raw and scraped, and with a final, desperate heave, the grate tore loose. He didn't have time to be gentle. He heard Silas's footsteps on the final steps, the heavy, dragging sound of his approach. "Go now!" Richard yelled, his voice a mix of terror and command. Marcus didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees and squeezed himself into the cramped, dark vent. The air inside was stale and thick with dust. He scrambled forward on his stomach, his heart hammering against the metal floor. He heard the door burst open behind him, and the low, guttural growl of Silas filled the space. The vent was a tight fit, but he was small enough to navigate the turns. He heard a struggle, a muffled shout, and then silence. A horrible, gut-wrenching silence. He couldn't look back. He had to keep moving. He crawled through the dark, twisting metal tunnel, his mind replaying Richard's sacrifice. He felt a profound sense of guilt, a heavy, crushing weight. He had promised to help, to get to the bottom of the story, and now the man who had helped him had been left behind. After what felt like an eternity, the vent opened up into a small, dark room. It was another cellar, but this one was different. It was cleaner, with a smooth concrete floor and thick, reinforced walls. He saw a wooden door, and he could see a sliver of light coming from beneath it. Hope surged through him. He was close. He was so close. He tried the handle of the door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open and found himself in a small, modern office. A desk, a chair, and a laptop sat on a table. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh, unforgiving light. The room smelled of fresh paint and new wood. This wasn't a part of the old lodge. This was a new addition. He saw a large, flat-screen monitor on the wall, and his blood ran cold. It was a series of cameras, a security system. The cameras showed different parts of the labyrinth, and he could see them all. He saw Silas dragging something, a body, back into the maze. He saw Elias sitting in a small, well-lit room, watching the monitors with a serene, almost detached expression. The realization hit him then, a stunning, brutal truth. They weren't just cannibals. They were content creators. He saw the laptop on the desk, and he walked over to it, his hands trembling. He lifted the screen and saw it. A video. A live stream. It was of him and Richard, as they had been in the tunnels. Their terror, their fear, their desperation. It was a show. A macabre game for a select few. The Callahans weren't just playing a game, they were selling it. Selling a live, interactive, horrifying reality show to a network of like-minded individuals. The hunting club Richard had mentioned wasn't a group of hunters. It was an exclusive audience, a network of voyeurs. He found a hard drive on the desk, a small black box. It had a label on it, the Callahan tapes. He knew what they were, the past and present, all recorded, all monetized, all for a twisted, insatiable audience. A voice, low and calm, echoed from behind him. "You found my office, Mr. Cole. I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd make it this far." He spun around and there was Elias standing in the doorway. He was holding a small, silver-plated pistol, his finger resting on the trigger. "You've seen too much. You know too much. You're a liability now. The game is over." Marcus's mind was racing. He was trapped. There was no way out. He had come here for a story, and he had found something far more chilling, a new form of evil, a crime that was not just about murder, but about spectacle, about entertainment. "Why?" Marcus asked, his voice strained. "Why all of this? The tunnels, the hunts, the live streams? Why? Why not?" Elias said, a strange, almost philosophical look on his face. "The world is a dull place, Mr. Cole. People are bored. They crave something real, something authentic. They want to see what it's like to be hunted, to feel the adrenaline, the fear. And my brother and I, we provide it. We are the masters of the macabre, the architects of dread. We have an audience, a select few who are willing to pay a great deal of money for the privilege of watching a real-life horror show." He raised the pistol, aiming it at Marcus's chest. "But your story ends here, Mr. Cole. You won't be writing about this. You'll be the star of the next show." The words hung in the air, a chilling threat. Marcus looked at the monitor, his eyes scanning the security footage. He saw the small, well-lit room where Elias had been watching him, and he saw something else. A flicker of movement, a flash of light, a small, dark shape. It was a person, a new person. He had been so focused on Elias and Silas that he had missed it. The new person was an accomplice, another member of the hunting club. But what was their purpose? Was there more to this? "You're a monster," Marcus said, his voice filled with a cold, righteous rage. "A monster?" Elias laughed, a low, cruel sound. "No, Mr. Cole, I am an artist. And you are my muse. Now say your goodbyes. The show is about to begin." Elias took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. Marcus knew his time was up. He had found the truth, but it was going to be the death of him. The sound of a car door slamming outside broke the silence, and he saw a flicker of panic cross Elias's face. The car was not a part of the show. It was an unexpected, uninvited audience. The sudden sound of a car door, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel, made Elias's hand waver. He turned his head, a flicker of surprise and annoyance in his eyes. He had planned this night meticulously, every detail accounted for, every outcome anticipated. An uninvited visitor was not on the schedule. "Who is it?" Elias snarled, his voice a low, guttural growl. Before Marcus could answer, the door to the office burst open. Standing in the doorway was a young woman with a determined look on her face. It was the same woman from the faded photograph in Eleanor's scrapbook, the girlfriend of Daniel. Her name was Sarah. She was older now, her face etched with the lines of a life lived with a great sorrow, but her eyes held a fierce, unyielding fire. "I knew it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I knew it was you, Elias." Elias's face twisted into a snarl of rage. You were supposed to be dead. You were supposed to be gone." "I was," Sarah said, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "You left me for dead. You thought I would be another victim, A body to add to your collection. But you were wrong. I survived. The truth, a new shocking layer of it, unraveled before Marcus's eyes. Sarah had been with Daniel. She had seen what had happened. She had been the one who escaped. You and Daniel came to my house that day, she said, her eyes locked on Elias. You and your brother. You told us you were going to show us something amazing, the hunting lodge, the labyrinth. You told us it was a game of wits. You said we were going to play, and we fell for it. We were so naive. Elias laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. You were. But you were a poor player. You ran, you screamed, you weren't a challenge, you weren't worth the effort. Silas caught Daniel and he brought him back, but you escaped. You ran out of the tunnels and into the woods. I thought you were gone forever. I thought the animals had gotten you. They almost did, Sarah said, a tear rolling down her cheek. I was a mess. I was lost for days. I was half starved, half frozen. I made it to the highway, and I found a truck. The driver, he was a kind man. He took me to the hospital. But I was so terrified. I was so broken. I couldn't speak. I couldn't tell anyone what happened. I was in a fugue state for weeks, and when I finally came out of it, no one believed me. They said I was hallucinating, a girl who had gone mad from the shock of losing her boyfriend. They said I had made it up, and I let them. I ran away. I ran away from this town, from this nightmare, but I never forgot. I always knew what you did to Daniel. She held up a small silver locket on a chain. Daniel gave me this. It has a picture of us in it. He said it was for good luck. I held onto it for 27 years. It was the only thing that kept me going. It was the only proof I had that it wasn't a nightmare. It was real. Marcus watched, stunned, as the scene unfolded. Sarah, the forgotten victim, had returned. The tables were turning. You're a fool, Elias said, his voice filled with a cold contempt. You should have stayed away. You should have let the past stay buried. You should have kept your mouth shut. Now you're a liability, and I have to clean up this mess. He aimed the pistol at Sarah. Marcus knew he had to do something. He had to act. He lunged at Elias, a desperate last-ditch effort to save a life. Elias fired, the shot echoing in the small office. The bullet hit the wall, a spray of drywall dust exploding into the air. Marcus crashed into Elias, sending him sprawling to the ground. The pistol flew from his hand and slid across the floor, coming to a stop near Sarah's feet. "Get it!" Marcus yelled. Sarah, her hands shaking, lunged for the pistol. Elias, his face a mask of furious rage, scrambled to his feet. He was a frail old man, but he was driven by a powerful, terrifying malice. He lunged for Sarah, his hands outstretched, his eyes filled with murder. But Sarah was faster. She grabbed the pistol, her hand steady now. She aimed it at Elias, her eyes filled with a righteous anger that had been simmering for 27 years. "For Daniel," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper. She pulled the trigger. The shot was loud, a deafening crack that seemed to shake the very foundations of the lodge. Elias fell, a small, dark stain spreading across his tailored suit. He looked at Sarah, a flicker of disbelief and then a final blank stare in his eyes. He was dead. The silence that followed was a profound, absolute thing. It was broken only by the sound of Marcus and Sarah's heavy breathing. They had done it. They had stopped the monster. But the nightmare wasn't over. They had to find a way out. They had to get help. And they had to find Richard. They heard a low, scraping sound from the tunnels. Silas was coming. The beast was still in the maze, and he was hungry. The scraping sound grew louder, a chilling reminder that the nightmare was far from over. Silas, driven by instinct and a lifetime of training, was coming for them. His primal hunger was a force of nature, an unstoppable, malevolent presence in the darkness. "He's coming," Marcus said, his voice a strained whisper. "We have to go." They had to find a way out, and they had to find it now. Marcus's gaze fell on the monitor. He saw a series of vents, small, interconnected tunnels that ran throughout the labyrinth. He had found a way into the office through one. There had to be a way out. He saw it then, on the security footage. A larger vent, partially hidden behind a shelf of old cans, in a small, seldom-used pantry just off the main cellar. It was the last exit, the one Elias had used for quick getaways. "This way," Marcus said, pointing to a door in the back of the office. "It leads to the pantry. We can get out through the vent." They ran, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the office. They found the pantry, a small, dark room filled with old, rotting food. Marcus scrambled to find the vent, his hands shaking. He found it behind a large, rusted shelf. It was a large metal grate, but it was bolted shut. He needed a tool. He looked around the room, his eyes desperate. He saw a small, rusted hammer on the floor. It was old, but it was heavy. He grabbed it and began to smash at the bolts. The sound was loud, a series of deafening clangs that seemed to fill the whole lodge. He heard Silas's low growl, much closer now. The beast was right behind them. He worked frantically, his hands bleeding from the effort. Finally, with a loud shriek of metal, the bolts gave way. The grate fell to the floor, a cloud of dust rising into the air. "Go!" Marcus yelled. "I'll go in after you." Sarah didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the vent, her body disappearing into the dark. Marcus followed her, his mind on Richard. He had to go back. He had to save him. He had to try. He turned back, and he saw a large, hulking figure at the entrance to the pantry. It was Silas. He was staring at them, his wild eyes filled with a predatory hunger. He was holding something. It was a body. It was Richard. He was not moving. He was dead. Marcus's heart sank. A profound sense of loss, a deep, bitter sorrow washed over him. Richard, a man who had been chasing a ghost for half his life, had found it. He had died a hero, a man who had sacrificed his life to save a stranger. Silas let out a low, guttural growl, and he began to move towards the vent. He was a force of nature, a creature of pure, unadulterated madness. He was unstoppable. "Go, Marcus." Sarah's voice echoed from the vent. "He's coming." Marcus, a cold, empty feeling in his chest, turned and crawled into the vent. The image of Richard's lifeless body seared into his mind. He crawled through the dark, cramped tunnel, the sound of Silas's angry shouts growing fainter behind him. They crawled for what felt like an eternity, and then they saw it. A light. It was the moon, shining through an opening in the side of the lodge. They were out. They had escaped. They emerged into the cold night air, their bodies covered in dirt and dust. They stood there shivering, their eyes on the old, dilapidated lodge. It stood as a grim monument to a dark, terrible truth. The Callahans were monsters, but they were also a product of their time, a macabre reflection of a society that was willing to pay for a thrill, for a front-row seat to a real-life horror show. Marcus and Sarah made their way to his truck. He started the engine and they drove away, leaving the lodge and its dark secrets behind. But the secrets, they knew, would not stay buried for long. They had proof. They had a story. They had to tell the world. Marcus had come to the Ozarks for a cold case, a ghost story. He had found something far more terrifying, a human drama, a tale of depravity and survival. He had lost a friend, but he had found a new purpose. He would tell the story of the Callahan brothers. He would expose their crimes. He would make sure that Daniel and Richard and all the others had not died in vain. He looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. They were two broken people, their lives forever changed by the horrors they had witnessed. But they had each other now. A shared bond forged in the darkness of the labyrinth. They were a testament to the power of human endurance, to the resilience of the human spirit. The story was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The Callahans' reign of terror was over, but their legacy, the legacy of human monsters, would live on. A chilling, terrifying reminder of the horrors that can be born in the heart of man.